Hi, welcome to my channel. My name's Steve Down and this is my guitar, Archimedes. Welcome to any new watchers, new subscribers. Great to have you here. We have just started a series looking at D Natural Blues by Wes Montgomery, and this is the second episode. The first episode, if you want to go back and take a look, goes through the head, and we've unpacked a few things from that we can learn from. The way that we generally do things here is that we take a tune and generally learn the head and the solo, and we'll learn it outright, but we'll also learn from it as well. We get creative with the concepts that the player used, so we try and get into what they might have been thinking, what rhythmic, harmonic and melodic devices they were using, so that we can use them in our own playing and get creative with. If you want to support the channel, then Patreon is the place to go to do that. The link is on the screen here. That is www.patreon.com/xtoguitarlessons. Thanks to all of my patrons so far. Welcome to Marco, Ian and Gustavo who joined the Patreon this week. I really appreciate your support. If you are just watching this and you don't want to get involved in the Patreon, but you do want to support me in some way, then there's a link to buy me a coffee below, and that's just a one-off bit of support. And I do need it because I do drink a lot of coffee, especially with two kids and when I'm trying to plan lessons. So let's get on with what we're looking at today. So today I want to share three things with you about the first chorus from the solo of D Natural Blues. I'm going to be using a plectrum for this rather than my thumb. The reason why I'm doing this is because I appreciate that a lot of you will probably be familiar with just using a plectrum rather than the thumb, and I want to make sure that you can actually learn some bits and pieces from this without having to focus too much on the thumb technique. So I'll be giving a few bits of advice about how to go about playing it with your thumb if you were to do that, but we'll be focusing mostly on pick technique with this. But I realise for Wes purists this might be a little bit offensive because I'm not using my thumb. But if so, then maybe this video isn't for you. So I want to look at three things. The first thing is connecting phrases together. The second is the diminished scale and the diminished chord and how Wes uses it. And the final one is superimposing 2-5-1s. So let's get started by looking at the first 4 bars, and we're going to look at connecting phrases. The first thing we can learn about this first part is that Wes connects his phrases really, really well. Now, there's 2 chords in the first 2 bars. There's that D7 and then the G7. And the phrase that he plays is... Okay, and that's so well connected together. He's not going all over the fretboard when he finishes the phrase on the D7. He plays something that's really nearby, and this is something we can learn from. So that first part, he's just using some notes from like a D9 kind of arpeggio, so D, C, and the E there. So he's just playing around with those 3 notes, which is a great way to start your solo with small bites. And then he moves to the G, but instead of going somewhere completely different, he connects it nearby. So he moves to the B natural, which is the 3rd of G7. So, and then runs down the arpeggio. So G, D, and then up through E to F. So he's spelling out that chord. This is something that is going to really help your soloing to be melodic. This is why this opening part is really easily singable, because it's so melodic. It's not jumping about all over the place. There is a place for that in solo, so I'm not saying that you should definitely not jump about all over the place. But if you want to make something really melodic and something that kind of sounds like Wes, then melody is the big thing here. And people like Wes and Jim Hall and Kenny, they're all absolute masters of melody in their solos. So how do we get there? So the thing is that when you're first starting out in jazz, you might end up just kind of looking at the chords and thinking, I need to play a different scale for each chord and a different arpeggio for each chord. And you end up just playing whichever positions are most comfortable or familiar to you. What this ends up sometimes looking like is this. But what we should instead be looking at is trying to connect the phrases together by playing something which is nearby. So something more like this. So how do we get there? This is the question. How do we go about getting to this point where we know our fretboard really well? And the way that I got over this when I was first learning is I took a bar of D-7 and a bar of G7. Obviously you can do it in any key, so with any 2-5, but I just chose a 2-5 in C. So I just took a bar of D-7 and a bar of G7, and I played quarter notes with the arpeggio of D-7 and then quarter notes with the arpeggio of G7. And what I did was I played around with the arpeggio, so going up for the D-7, and then what I did was I found the nearest note from G7. And so the nearest note for me as I finish on that C, the nearest note in G7 is B. So B, and then coming back down the arpeggio, G, F, D. So, and then I did the same thing for another bar. The nearest note going back to D-7 is C. So C, and then you could go back up or you could go down. I'm going to choose to go down here. So C, A, F, D. And then the nearest note for G7 again would be B. So you end up that way you end up learning where the notes are on the fretboard is in that position, and then you could move to a completely different position on the guitar. It's not massively creative, it's quite boring sounding, I'll grant you, but what it does help with is learning your fretboard and learning where the notes are in the arpeggios. Then you can start to move on to the next phase, which is getting creative with it. So one thing that I learned from my guitar teacher was to improvise towards target notes. And target notes are basically notes that spell out the chord that you're working towards. So you end up playing something that makes sense whilst working towards the next chord. And the technique that my guitar teacher gave to me was to pick a small chord sequence like D-7 to G7 and decide on the target note that you're working towards, and then make a line that works towards that target note, and making sure that the target notes are on the strong beats, beats 1 and beats 3. And that way you end up spelling out the changes like Wes has done in the first 2 bars. Here's an example of me doing that in my improvisation. And so I've done that in the key of G. So my chords are A minor 9 to D13 flat 9, and then back to G major 7. And you'll see that in the first bar, the first note that I play is a B natural on there, which spells out the A minor 9 by bringing out that 9. And then on the third beat, I play this note. So I'm working towards that note, which is the minor 7 of A minor, so the flat 7 of A minor. And then on the next bar, on the D13 flat 9, I work towards a flat 9. And then on the third beat, I work towards the 13, which is the B. And then finally, I work towards the G to resolve it back to G again. So I've picked my target notes and I'm working towards them. Now, your target notes don't always have to be on 1 and 3. They could be on 3 or on 1. So here's another example of that where I've just phrased it so that it's on 1. And here you'll see that I've started with the flat third of the A minor 7, and then I start on the 1 with the flat 9 of the D13 flat 9. And there I'm working all the way through that A minor 7 bar, that first bar, towards that flat 9. So I'm working towards that target note because I decided that I wanted to go towards that sound in the next bar. Now this is something that Joe Pass explores an awful lot in his book Guitar Style. So this book, which I'm just putting a picture up here, is really, really invaluable for exploring this kind of stuff. He doesn't explicitly talk about target notes and everything, but you can see it in his playing, and what he's teaching in that book does bring that idea out. In the next two bars, we've got Wes running up a D13 arpeggio, which is a fun little shape to play. And then he runs back down. And then we've got an interval here of a fourth, and then he runs down, connecting again. This is really, really good. He's working towards his target note. He's working towards that A minor, so he works towards an E, which is the fifth of A minor 7. So then he runs down an A minor 7 arpeggio, and he's got this really cool little connecting idea, going chromatically, major 7, so the G sharp, flat 7, and that's the G natural, and then connects into the next chord, the D7, by going to an F, and then taking that up to an F sharp, the third, and then running up a D7 flat 9. So that's such a cool little phrase. And then connects it back to the G again. So it's just master phrasing there. And like the target notes that he's going for, they really spell out the chord changes, and it's so melodic and smooth. It's really, really great, and we can really learn from this. And I think using that approach by learning your fretboard, learning where the arpeggios are and how to connect them, changing from one bar to another, and then working towards target notes, I think that'll really help you in being able to kind of achieve that kind of melodic sound in your soloing. So the second thing I want to talk about is diminished chords and the diminished scale and how Wes uses it here. So here's the two bars where we see this. So here we're on the 4 chord, which is the G7. And here is something that I kind of call a gospel lift in a blues, where basically you have a sharp 4 diminished. So you've got your G7 and then a G sharp diminished, either going back to the 1, which he does, and sometimes they'll put the 5th in the bass on the 1, so like that. So you'll have G7, G sharp diminished, and then a D7 with an A in the bass. So you get that kind of chromatic run from G to G sharp to A. Or it can go to the 5th chord, so like that. And this is something that you kind of invariably see in bar 6 of a blues, which is where we see it here. So diminished chords are highly symmetrical, and that's kind of what gives them that kind of peculiar tonality. So you start with with the note that you want the diminished chord on, so G sharp, and then you go up a minor 3rd, and then up another minor 3rd, and then up another minor 3rd, and then you put them all together, and you get your diminished 7th chord. So here's a little helpful picture of that. This is using C as the diminished chord that we're working from, because C is sometimes a good place to start from, because everything's no accidentals and no sharps and flats, so it's a good kind of clean slate to start from. What's really interesting here is that when you use the diminished chord in this context, where you're using it as a sharp 4 diminished, the actual diminished chord spells out a dominant 7th flat 9 of the 4 chord. So your notes of G sharp diminished, G sharp, F, B, and D, so spell out a G7 flat 9, which is cool because you get like a kind of altered sound. So you don't necessarily have to have the diminished chord running for you to play that kind of diminished arpeggio. So if you have a G7 chord running, you can quite easily play that kind of line, that kind of thing over the top of it, which suggests diminish without there actually having been the harmony underneath. And sometimes your bandmates will catch that, and they'll play, if you've got a keyboard player or an organ player, they'll catch that and they'll play a diminished chord underneath just to echo what you're doing, which is cool because then you get lots of interaction with your bandmates. So what Wes does here in his line, he's got this really cool thing. So we did that. Okay, and he's really spelling out that G, in case you were wondering that it wasn't a G7. He really spells it out, because you've got the B, and then G enclosing into F. And then he runs down to here, this really cool little lick. running up the G sharp diminished scale, and then back to spell out D again. So it's really, really cool how he does that. It connects so well. So he runs down a G arpeggio, using some chromatic passages, chromatically from E down to D, and then going to the third, the B, and then going chromatically down from G to F, and then starting the diminished scale, the G sharp, and this one is the G sharp half whole diminished scale, which is a scale that works really well over diminished seventh chords. And that scale is this scale here. And what Wes does is, as he comes off of that flat 7 from the G, he goes down to an E and runs up. And then encloses, to go back to D7, he encloses the note of D. E, C sharp, D, A. And resolves it so beautifully. Really, really beautiful. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is superimposing 2/5 chord changes where there aren't any 2/5 chord changes in the harmony. So let's just look at what Wes is doing in bars 7, 8, and 9, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so if you watch the last video on the head, you'll notice we talked about secondary dominants. Now, Wes didn't use a secondary dominant, it was a -6 that he used, but here he actually does use a secondary dominant, which is something that is common in a jazz blues. What he does, which is really interesting here, and it is supported by the harmony, is he moves down from an F sharp -7 to a B7, which is a 2/5 in E, and then an F -7 to a B flat 7, which is a 2/5 in E flat, and then he moves towards that chord that he's aiming for, which is E -7. Now that is the 2 of the 5, A7, going back to the 1, the D7. What's really interesting here is the fact that what he's really doing is he's having this kind of chromatic movement down from F sharp, F to E. That's what he's really going for there, and those dominants there, they serve as support for it. The secondary dominant is the B7 there, which is making the 6th chord a dominant. Now, obviously in the recording you can hear it supported, what he's doing in the solo, by the chords underneath. So the pianist and the bass player are all playing those chords. But what we can take away from this is that they don't do that every single time. And later on in this solo and in other solos, Wes superimposes these chord changes by suggesting it in his solo when they aren't in the harmony at all. And that's something we can do to create some really nice phrases that are super connective, and also create a lovely kind of descending melody, which is always a really pleasing melody in our solos. So the first thing that he plays actually in bar 7 is an E minor 9 arpeggio. He sets it up like that. Then over the ensuing sets of 2/5s, the first thing he does is over the 2 to the subdominant, so the 2 to the 5 there, the F sharp -7 to the B7. What he plays there is essentially an F sharp minor 9 arpeggio, which is descending. Okay, and you could see that as an A major 7 arpeggio if it makes it easier for you. They're one and the same thing because of the relative minor relationship. And then for the next 2/5, which goes down chromatically, F minor 7 to B flat 7, he uses an F minor 9 arpeggio. And he's got that really slippery kind of slide thing there. Okay, and what that does there is that, again, it looks a little bit like an A flat major 7 arpeggio, and that's again the relative minor relationship. So you could see it that way if it helps you, because that's quite common as an A flat major 7 shape there. So he's going down in semitones there, and then he goes down to when he hits the E minor, which is that 2, the 2 chord, the 2 minor chord. He plays an E minor 9 arpeggio. With a little bit of Dorian flavour in there with the C sharp. What he's doing is following down that structure and repeating it down here. So there's a continuity of moving those arpeggios, those minor 9 arpeggios going down, which is spelling out those chords. The F sharp minor 7 going to the F minor 7, going to the E minor 7. Now this just shows you that when you see those quick 2/5s, you don't necessarily have to play over the top of the 5. You can just ignore it like Wes did. All he's doing there is just playing minor 9 arpeggios going down. And that creates more melody than if he tried to force in some arpeggios from the dominant chords there. So you don't always have to do that. But the thing that I really want to stress on this is the fact that you don't have to have those chords there supported in the harmony like Wes does for that first chorus to be able to play that stuff, because you could still do it even if you had just this going in your harmony. Or even just 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, going in those bars there, okay, going in bars 7 to 8. So you don't necessarily have to have all of that harmony there in order to do that. You can just superimpose it over the top of it and it still sounds cool. So the last few bars there, really, really cool blues stuff. Really, really cool blues stuff. And the main thing here, it's not really a massive point I wanted to talk about, but it's just to lay back a little bit, because he is really behind the beat on this. So try playing with a click and just try playing really behind the beat on it. Lay back on it a bit. It's almost like Wes is playing kind of out of time almost, but it creates that really lazy, lovely feel. So what are our takeaways? The first takeaway from this is going to be to make sure that you're connecting your phrases. So we can do that by making sure that we know our fretboard and we know where the arpeggios are in the first place, then picking some target notes and improvising towards them. The second takeaway from this is the diminished chord, the sharp 4 diminished 7th chord, making sure that you know how that chord is made up, how it relates to the 4 chord, and also which scale to use over the top of it, which is that G sharp whole half diminished scale. That's a really difficult sentence to say. And just making sure that you're, again, connecting the phrases, because it's a very peculiar sounding scale, and if you run up it like Wes does, you need to make sure that you're landing it properly back onto the 1. And the next thing to take away from this is superimposing those 2/5s, and we just went through a really complex passage on that, talking about why you don't necessarily need that supported in the harmony, but it's useful to also make sure that you're not always having to feel like you have to play over every single chord. You can zoom out and see the bigger picture and do what Wes does, which is basically over those 2/5s, he's just adhering to the 2 minor chord, and he's playing minor 9 arpeggios descending down, which is a really lovely melodic device. The final thing is just that laid back bluesy feel that you get at the end there. So stick your clicks on and try playing behind the beat rather than on it. Really try and match what Wes does. So thanks for watching if you got this far. Thanks so much to my patrons again, Marco, Gustavo and Ian. Welcome this week. On the Patreon you get all of the transcriptions of the solo, you get the scale and exercise packs, and you get the backing track as well. And there's also some extras on there, and everything from the previous series and series I don't know what the plural of series is, and more. So I will see you next week for the next chorus in this. Have a great practicing week. I hope lockdown isn't too stressful for you, and stay safe. See you next week. Bye.